I welcome you to the 2021 Franciscan Zoom lecture series hosted by the Franciscan School of Theology. Our presenter tonight, Brother William Short, OFM, is a Franciscan friar of the St. Barbara province and professor of spirituality here at FST. He is also the director of the International Center for Franciscan Study and Research at St. Isidore's College in Rome, where he resides. He lectures widely on early Franciscan sources and is one of the editors of the 4-volume series, Francis of Assisi, Early Documents. I welcome Brother Bill.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening and to share with you one of my favorite images of St. Francis. And I would like to preface this with a personal remark from my own family. One of my sisters, Colleen, is a very avid student of art and taught art appreciation in local schools near our home in Seattle, Washington. And she was the one who alerted me to the importance of the painting we're going to be talking about tonight. Giovanni Bellini, St. Francis in the Desert, formerly known and still cited as St. Francis in Ecstasy by some authors. We were together in New York attending different meetings many years ago, and Colleen and I made a date to meet at the Frick Collection on Fifth Avenue, where the painting that I'll be talking about tonight is located. We spent a long afternoon admiring this painting, noticing different things about it, telling each other our discoveries. And now, many years later, it's the fruit of all of these intervening years that I'm sharing with you tonight. I can say that this painting, its history, the succession of its owners over the centuries have become a kind of hobby verging on a mania of mine. Let's begin, though, by talking about the painting itself and its importance for understanding the ways in which people have looked at St. Francis over the centuries. Francis Transfigured, Bellini's painting of St. Francis in the desert as Franciscan theology. Here we have an aerial view of a tiny island in the lagoon of Venice. It's the home of a Franciscan church and friary called San Francesco del Deserto, St. Francis of the Desert, dating back to the 13th century. There is a long-standing legend that on his return from the Middle East and Egypt in the summer of 1220, that Francis actually disembarked from a ship in Venice, and that a local benefactor there offered to Francis this island for himself as a place of solitude and contemplation, and for his brothers who would like to stay there. To this day, it remains a Franciscan house, one of the few that is reached only by boat. The church itself is very spare. It's been damaged heavily over the years by wars and occupations, most recently by Napoleon and his troops. Yet it maintains its Franciscan character of beauty and simplicity. There are even some who believe that this might have been the original home of the painting that we are looking at tonight, though that is much disputed. People continue to visit this place because of the tranquility of its island location, The friars here shown in their cloister are very welcoming of guests who make the trip by boat to get to the island, and they give tours to explain to people the importance of this place and the tradition that has linked St. Francis to Venice for over 800 years. It's that tradition, devotion to the figure of St. Francis in Venice, that brings us to our artist. Giovanni Bellini. He was born and he died and he worked all of his life in Venice. He was one of those great artists of the Italian Renaissance who forged a new path in the way that he portrayed the human figure, nature. He was also very sensitive to religious themes, and a number of his greatest paintings, in fact, picture either scenes from the gospel or the lives of saints. Arguably, his masterpiece, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the painting of St. Francis that we will be looking at tonight. This is where I originally saw the painting, in the living room of the old Frick Mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York. Picture me and my sister Colleen on I think it was a wintry afternoon. There weren't many people around. We could spend a lot of time with that painting in the middle on the wall. That is Bellini's St. Francis. But if you go to the Frick today or tomorrow, don't rush there, please, because it's not there anymore. It's here. The Frick collection on Fifth Avenue is undergoing a major restoration, and they've transferred most of their collection to what they call the Frick Madison, just on the other side of town. This is a very stark environment. It is mostly poured concrete. The architecture is by Marcel Breuer. In a way, though, it fits the contemplative character of this painting. The single window, a plain bench, concrete ceiling and walls, and just that painting all by itself. If I could go to New York right now, I think I would actually enjoy seeing it in its temporary home, where it will probably stay for a few years. And this is the painting itself. When you first look at it, and perhaps some of you know it and love it already, there is a natural landscape, rocky, mountainous, in the foreground. In the background, there's a city, and we can't identify it easily with any known Italian city. It represents human civilization not very far away. But clearly, this mountain is at a distance. It can be seen from afar, but it's not easy to get to. One of the other general characteristics of the painting that I noticed very clearly when I was at the Frick is that the foreground is a kind of bluish color. Those rocks behind the figure of St. Francis are in a rather pale light, and it has a bluish cast. Whereas the city in the background seems to be illuminated in a different way, with a warmer light. This unusual characteristic has been called the duo lumina, the two lights. In 2011, I was invited back to the Frick for a symposium that gathered a group of people who were very familiar with Franciscan sources, and the curators of the Frick collection presented the newly restored painting, which had been several years at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, undergoing a restoration. After we finished the symposium late afternoon, they closed the museum and they invited us, the few participants, maybe we were a dozen or so, to come into the place where the newly restored painting hangs, which is the old living room, its original location. But they turned off all the electric lights. And they only had 2 candelabra on a table in the middle of the room, saying that this was probably the light in which it would have been viewed in Venice for hundreds of years without electricity. In that light, what was remarkable to me is that the foreground that here appears to have a bit of a grayish or bluish cast actually seemed chilly. It seemed to be night. And either that was moonlight or it was just that twilight before dawn. It was very noticeably blue, much bluer than it appears here. We then have 2 lights illuminating 2 different parts of the picture, and they come from 2 different sources. Let's go in a little bit closer now and see where Francis is looking. He's looking upward. He's looking toward a tree, and beyond that tree is the frame of the painting. What has captured Francis's attention is outside the frame. People have actually removed the frame at the Met in order to see if there was something painted there. And they said, no, it really ends right there. But notice the light that is illuminating the tree and illuminating the rock and illuminating the face of Francis seems to come from above left. And it's a different color from the light that is illuminating that city that actually has shadows that are going in a different direction. Very curious. But let's look a little bit more closely at the tree itself. That tree is bending, as we see in the image on the left. It's bending outward, and then it's starting to curl back. It's as if this light is actually pushing the tree, but it's also attractive. It's pulling the tree back by its top. This is a very powerful light. And whatever is the source of that light is what has captured the attention of Francis. But now let's look under the tree, where we see a shepherd with his flock. As we'll see in a moment, he's looking up at us on the mountain. And critics say that we should be thinking of the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. We can actually look at that strong light and those elongated leaves on that tree as if they were on fire. This could be a hint that we're looking at Moses meeting the burning bush, where God is revealed in the wilderness at a mountain. Here we see closer up that shepherd looking so intently at us. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Francis has taken off his sandals. He has put down a staff that looks very much like the staff carried by that shepherd. The shepherd Moses, the mountain of Horeb, the flaming fire coming out of a bush with intense light, all of these give us hints that the mountain that we are looking at has many different names. For Franciscans, what would first come to mind is that this is the mountain of Verna in Tuscany, and that Francis is there during his long retreat in 1224, 2 years before he died. But as we will see, this is also Mount Horeb and it is Mount Sinai, because Giovanni Bellini has introduced these notes, these allusions into the picture to give us a theological reading of the figure of Francis. And I think a theological reading that he got not by himself, but from the friars who lived and worked in the Venice that he knew in the 15th century. Let's look at another image of the mountain of Verna and the figure of Francis praying. This is from Giotto, the frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis. And there we read the account by Thomas of Celano, his treatise on the miracles of St. Francis. The Holy One of God, always compassionate to the distressed, immediately leaped down from the donkey. We say, how did we get a donkey here? Here, Francis is traveling up to the mountain of Verna, riding on a donkey provided by the peasant that we see sipping from a stream down below. That peasant had become so tired out from the heat traveling in August, a very hot month in Italy, that he begged Francis to find some water for him. Francis therefore dismounts from the donkey, knelt down on the ground, and raised his hands to heaven, praying unceasingly until he understood he had been heard. Hurry now, he said to the peasant, and over there you will find living water, which at this very hour Christ has mercifully brought forth from the rock for you to drink. Water from the rock at a mountain. This should be making us think of Moses once again, because it is Moses who strikes the rock to give water to the people in the book of Numbers, chapter 20. And here in the bottom left of the painting, we see a proper water spout stuck into the side of that mountain and a good flow of clear water coming out. But not only is this an allusion to Moses and to the story from the treatise on the miracles, but probably also to Paul, writing in the first letter to the Corinthians, speaking of the people being led by Moses, they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Could it be then that this great mountain that we're seeing here, this great rock, in fact, is more than geography? Is the rock itself Christ on whom Francis stands? The figure of Francis himself, his face looking upward, his hands open as if in prayer or in speech. That open mouth seems to be speaking or could be singing. That figure is intent on something in the left-hand corner, the upper left-hand frame, where he is seeing that light. But what surrounds the figure of Francis? On the left-hand side, there's a rabbit sticking its head out of a hole. Now, that's a curious detail. He's under Francis's right hand. Under Francis's left hand, there is a classic Tuscan oil jug. The jar that is used for storing the great olive oil that is one of the most delicious products of Tuscany. A rabbit and an oil jar. Let's go to the book of Exodus. Looks like I have a typo there. I think I spelled exodsu, but you know that I mean the book of Exodus. Here is Moses talking to God once again. On Sinai, Moses said in Exodus 33, "Show me your glory, I pray." But God said, "You cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live." And the Lord continued, "See, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." By a curious combination of interpretation and imagination, the figure of the rabbit in a cleft of the rock came to symbolize Moses for the Christian authors of the first centuries. Lupusculus, the little rabbit, was the nickname for Moses used in scriptural commentaries by people like St. Jerome. What an educated medieval or early Renaissance viewer of this picture could have realized is that Francis's hand is shading or covering the rabbit so that the rabbit does not see that strong light that Francis is seeing. But what about that oil jar? Here we have to look to the book of Kings. And here it is Elijah the prophet who is evoked, who says to the widow at Zarephath, "Do not be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, that is, make some food for me. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." This strategically placed olive oil jar, then, is another allusion, an allusion to another important Old Testament figure, the prophet Elijah. If Moses is at the right hand of Francis and Elijah is at the left hand, Francis then is in a kind of transfiguration. We turn to Luke chapter 9. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Well, Francis's habit is not exactly white, but it does seem to have a bright light on it. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. This is Francis participating in a transfiguration experience in which he is looking towards something that we cannot see, the source of great light, and the symbols of Moses and Elijah are equidistant at his right and left hand. It is Francis participating in the life of Christ as one who shares in this experience himself. He is living in Christ. And we might say on the rock, he is standing on Christ as this has happened. But now let's take a closer look at the hands of Francis and the cord. Because in the cord, can you see there's a little piece of paper, a note that's stuck in his cord. Another curious detail. What in the world is that? The hands clearly show little red marks on them. This, of course, is a reference to the Stigmata, the feast that we will be celebrating in Franciscan churches next week on September 17th, the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis. We know that at his death, the body of Francis had growths on his hands, his feet, and a wound, a scar on his side that had dripped blood. We know that these began to appear, according to Thomas of Celano, his first biographer, shortly after a vision that Francis had on the mountain of Verna, the vision of a seraph in the form of a crucified man. This vision made a strong impression on Francis, but he didn't understand its meaning. And later, these marks. Thomas of Celano says, a little while later, the marks began to appear. Some people have described this as a scene of the stigmatization of St. Francis, but it doesn't seem to be exactly that. It seems to be something that happens after the stigmata have begun to appear, aliquantulum, a little while later. The foot of Francis, too, barely shows a trace, a mark in the middle of his, the upper part of his foot, where a mark is beginning to appear. It's not really very evident. If Bellini had wanted to make this about the stigmatization of Francis, he would have made these marks on the body much more noticeable. As it is, they're barely visible, though they are present. Looking at that foot of Francis, however, also draws our attention back to the mountain. There is something that resembles almost a lava flow coming down from the mountain. But if you look at it from some distance, it actually appears to be very much like the foot of Francis, with the arch, with its toes. Francis is in harmony with nature, and nature is in harmony with Francis. He fits into this natural scene. And again, if the model for the creation of all things is the humanity of Christ, there's no good reason why the foot of Francis and this stone foot that appears as a kind of lava flow should not have the same form, for both are formed in him and with him and through him, through whom all things were made. But let's go back to that note. Probably not a laundry list. Francis didn't wash very much. Probably not a grocery list. There are no shops nearby on the mountain of Verna. But clearly Bellini wants us to notice that there's a crinkled piece of parchment there. Probably not paper. Parchment would be more commonly used. Now we turn to Brother Leo, Francis's companion during that long retreat on the mountain of Verna, and to this piece of parchment, one of the few things that we have in Francis's own handwriting, the praises of God, the prayer that he composed on that mountain. On the other side of this parchment, Brother Leo has written these words in Latin in his very tidy handwriting in red ink. 2 years before his death, the Blessed Francis spent 40 days on Mount La Verna, from the feast of the Assumption of the Holy Virgin Mary, so August 15th, until the September feast of St. Michael, September 29th. In honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, and the Blessed Michael, the Archangel. And the Lord's hand was upon him. After the vision and message of the seraph and the impression of Christ's stigmata upon his body, he composed these praises written on the other side of this page and wrote them in his own hand, thanking God for the kindness bestowed on him. In this figure, then, with Francis having his hands open, already beginning to show traces of these marks of the stigmata, and with that parchment tucked into his cord, I think we can make a fair guess that Bellini is saying that that may be the clue to what Francis is saying or singing. Some have suggested this is the Canticle of Brother Sun or the Canticle of the Creatures, which would be perfectly appropriate, but it's actually associated with the next year of Francis's life, 1225, and it's associated with a different place, the community of St. Clare and her sisters at San Damiano. This writing, the praises of God, is the only writing that we know, along with the blessing for Brother Leo on its other side, which was written by Francis at this time in this place. That may be the clue to what Francis's prayer was, a prayer of thanksgiving to God for the grace that he had received in that vision and the allocution, the words that he heard, very mysterious, whatever those words were, from that vision of the seraph. But now let's have a little fun with some other animals. The animals in this picture are not random. And just like the sheep in the background could be ordinary Tuscan sheep, and that could be a very ordinary Tuscan shepherd, knowing a little bit about Giovanni Bellini, we may think that these, like that shepherd, may have a deeper meaning, and it may come from the Old Testament. For the donkey here, the wild creature that is there in the middle, we can turn to that story of Francis and the peasant. But there's no good reason why that peasant would have left his donkey with Francis for 40 days. Presumably, he needed it for his work. And what about that heron or egret, whatever that long-legged bird is? That's clearly a water creature and has no place up here. What are the clues? The clue in the Latin text of the Bible that Bellini would have known, like St. Francis, refers to this creature in Psalm 102, verse 6. It's a reference to a bird that lives in the wilderness. I have become like a pelican of the wilderness. But the word pelican in the Latin, pelicanus, does not mean that big seabird with the great big jowls on it that we see, at least here along the coast of California, frequently. Rather, the word pelicanus means all sorts of different birds, including water birds like herons and egrets. They are considered to be pelicans for those who read the Latin Bible. They're associated with the wilderness from this text of the psalm. These are people, these are animals who dwell in solitude, like Francis himself, who is in solitude here. And if that donkey is not just left there by the peasant, which seems unlikely, then it's probably the wild ass from the book of Job, chapter 39. Who has set out the wild ass free, and who has loosed his bonds? This is not a domesticated animal because it doesn't have a cord around its neck, a rope or a halter. And we also know that Francis was opposed to the keeping of domestic animals by his brothers. They could use them for some necessary purpose, but they were not to keep them with them. So this is a free creature of the wilderness, again in Latin with a very particular name, onager, onager. The desert ass or the wild ass, a creature of the wilderness. The animals themselves are pointing to the importance of solitude, wilderness, or, to use the Latin word for a deserted place, desert, desertum. But Giovanni Bellini also likes to wink at the viewer. There's a little bush down in the lower left-hand corner of the painting, and there's a scrap of paper that has been blown there by the wind, apparently, and is just sticking for a moment while that wind is blowing to the branches of that very dead-looking tree. And on it, in Latin, is the name Ioannes Bellinus, Giovanni Bellini. A little way for him to make himself present in the painting in a very unobtrusive way. There's lots more to be said about this painting. And as Michelle had told you at the beginning, you're going to have a link to an image of this where you can magnify it a great deal and you can zoom in on details, something that's hard for me to do here live during the lecture. But I want you to take a look at the overall structure of the painting after what we have said. Two lights, one source of light illuminating the town that seems to be a daylight, and a cool light that may be moonlight or twilight or very early morning coming from a different source. It is lighting up a tree so much that it seems that it could be a burning bush, which has attracted the view from a distance of that shepherd in the wilderness with a flock near a mountain, recalling the figure of Moses with the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. We have the figure of Francis, hands extended in prayer, marks of the stigmata beginning to appear, but not clearly the point of this painting. There is no seraph in the form of a crucified man, though people have searched for it and even removed the frame of the painting to try to see what's there. That was clearly left out. The source of light is left mysterious. But it is clearly a divine light. The figure of Francis is lighted up by it, and that figure is surrounded by two important Old Testament symbols, the rabbit, the symbol of Moses, and the oil jug, the symbol of Elijah. This is Francis himself transfigured. If you have time later, you might explore that little booth over on the right, that hut. Could this be the response to Peter's suggestion, let us build 3 huts or 3 booths here, even emphasizing more that this is a transfiguration scene? Or as some have suggested, is this the Feast of Booths, so important in John's Gospel, when Christ stands up and says, I am the vine, you are the branches, the true vine. And Bonaventure writes a beautiful meditation on this text, the mystical vine, in which he said the vine is the cross on which Christ dies. And if you look very closely, hanging under that vine in that little hut or booth, there's a proper little cord that's attached to a bell, almost invisible. You don't need a bell if you're all by yourself. Francis has a prayer book there, most likely the breviary, along with a skull, a typical edition of 15th century art after the great deaths of the plagues that had swept through Europe at the time. But you don't need a bell if you pray by yourself. The story we know from Brother Leo is that Brother Leo was his companion during this retreat on the mountain. In most scenes of the Stigmata, Brother Leo is holding a breviary at one side of the painting, absorbed in his reading, while Francis has a vision of the seraph. Here we see no seraph, and we don't see Brother Leo. Unless we are Brother Leo, that we are standing further up on the mountain, and we are eavesdropping on this scene. When it's time for prayer, Francis will ring that bell, and Brother Leo will come to join him, because Francis always wanted another brother to be with him when he prayed. Could it be that in this wonderful painting by Giovanni Bellini, not only is Francis present, but we are present as the companion of Francis? We are the new Brother Leo. There are marvelous books that help you to interpret this painting. They've helped me tremendously. John Fleming's book, From Bonaventure to Bellini, an essay in Franciscan exegesis, and Bill Cook, The Art of the Franciscan Order in Italy. And finally, Susanna Rutherglen and others, In a New Light, Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, which is the fruit of that symposium I attended in 2011. This is the link to an interactive image at Google Arts and Culture. And this link will be in the chat so that you can access this later. You can zoom in and see details that I'm not able to show to you. I want to thank you, however, for participating in this lecture, for sharing a little bit of my passion that was introduced to me by my sister Colleen, for this wonderful image of St. Francis transfigured. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brother Bill, for your lecture. This opportunity is brought to you by the Franciscan School of Theology Development Department. Let us give a collective applause to Brother Bill.